Hello, everybody. Tony Bacigalupo here, and I am so grateful to have an opportunity to have a conversation with Josh Packard. Josh Packard is the executive director of Springtide, and he is a sociologist of religion. He's in Greeley, Colorado, and he is studying some really, really important stuff around belonging, around religion, around youth, so many topics that we got to touch on. And so, Josh, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Yeah, thanks, Tony, for having me. I mean, it's an important topic, and I'm glad to see it getting addressed from so many angles here, and I'm excited to be part of the conversation.
And I should say, Dr. Josh Packard.
Yeah, you can call me Josh.
I'll call you Josh. I appreciate that. So tell me, I'm always interested in what drives people into the work that they do when it concerns belonging and community and those kinds of things. Because I feel like everybody has some kind of a personal connection to how they ended up where they are. You know, like there are probably some jobs, a lot of jobs people do where they do the job because it was a job that was available, it matches the skill set, it's not necessarily a value thing. But I find that people who work in this world, there tends to be some value alignment and some personal story there. So I'm just kind of curious if you could tell me a little bit about, you know, your life story and how you ended up where you are and how this kind of connects to your own story. And I realize it's super open-ended, so take that however you want.
Yeah, I'll do it in 15 seconds. No, I come to this specific work out of a point of frustration, really, and the that frustration was sort of I don't want to say at the end of an academic career, but at the turning point of an academic career for me, where I went through undergrad, and then I went to Vanderbilt and got a PhD in sociology, and went in to just do normal teaching and research kind of stuff. And my particular interests were around organizations and their effectiveness or the lack thereof. And ended up having a lot of contacts because of friends that I knew and other things in the religious world. So I was using largely religious congregational Christian settings as a way to examine new religious forms and movements and sort of like how people could make meaning in other lives. And that long series of events there led me to writing this book called Church Refugees. And Church Refugees was largely about why people kept their faith, but left the congregations that they were a part of. So, you know, as opposed to the sort of, if your listeners here are familiar with the religious trends in this country, they'll know the term nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not like Catholic nuns. These are the people who don't claim any religious affiliation, and they're, when we ask them on surveys to check the box, they check the box that says no affiliation. But I was really interested in this group that still claimed the affiliation, but just didn't like the organization, the institution side of it. And I got opportunities to go around the country and talk to congregations and groups of people, as some of my friends put it. One of them said to me one time, like, "You're really important to a very small group of people." Which I thought was a perfect way of summing up like why I would find myself in rural Pennsylvania, like driving a rental car through the night to talk to a group of 50 pastors or something. And I looked up one day at my wife, and I, had done, I don't know, 30, 40 of these events over a couple of years. And I said, I don't think any of it has mattered. Like, I don't think, this is well researched. I'm confident in what I'm saying. It's delivered in a way that isn't academic. We've worked really, really hard, talked with a lot of friends who are professional speakers and do workshops to corporate settings and other places and religious groups to, make sure it wasn't super nerdy. And yet I just couldn't see any place where we were able to move the needle in terms of how a particular religious organization was actually acting. And so kind of set it aside. I just was like, well, maybe this is, maybe I'm not the right person to do it. Maybe this is just not the right idea, and I'm not the person to make a difference in these spaces. Or maybe those spaces just aren't going to change, and I don't know of any other way to do it. And so I kind of shifted into doing organizational consulting in the for-profit world, and was dealing with the culture change and community building in those places. And then this opportunity came along to start this research institute. It's a national research institute called Springtide Research Institute, and to focus on the inner and outer lives of young people. The premise being that it's not that young people are leaving the church, they're increasingly, or religion. I mean, I don't mean the Christian church, I mean all churches, all religions. They're not leaving them, they aren't raised in them to begin with anymore. And so if we're going to really understand like how they make meaning in their lives, We can't understand that through an organizational or institutional lens. If we're going to understand sort of like what is the loss of having those trusted adults and those religious and spiritual guides and mentors, what does that look like and how does that show up in their lives? Well, we can't do that by just looking at mosques and synagogues and congregations. And so that led us to this first study that we did at Springtide called Belonging, because one of the data point that got us really going was a study from Cigna that came out a couple of years ago about using the standard UCLA loneliness index, which has been in use for now nearly 40 years or more, and showing that for the first time ever, it's not only were loneliness and isolation levels off the charts, but it was the younger generations that were more lonely and isolated than any other generation. Now that's never happened before. So not usually when we track these things, it's always older generations that are experiencing significant levels, or the highest levels rather, of loneliness and isolation, for reasons I think we can all probably understand if we sit and think about it for a second. And it's counterintuitive to think about teenagers that way because they're connected to devices. Like we have these stereotypes of young people about like how plugged in they are to the world, and we think like, how could they possibly be alone when they're so connected? And we see that fundamentally at Springtide as connected to this sort of loss of spiritual community. And we are not advocates at Springtide for a particular, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, something else entirely, agnostic, whatever. But the lack of Tony, before we press record, we were talking about knowing yourself and sort of being able to answer and even ask life's most important questions. We see that as critical to the development of young people. And so at Springtide, we say, we believe that no young person should have to answer life's most important questions alone. But increasingly, what we find is that that's what they're doing, that they don't have the sense of belonging. They're disconnected from the communities that care about them. And so we want to be part of the solution of figuring out how to make that happen.
Amazing. And what a segue, really a setup into, okay, I'm in, I see the problem, it's real, and wow, what a line. We believe no young person should have to answer life's importance questions alone. Really, no person should have to, but especially young people, right? And that they're getting on a path that it's gonna get harder and harder as you go, the longer you go without having some support and some guidance.
For sure.
So, so what do we do? Or like, how are you approaching how to figure out what we do, and who is we even? What does who do?
Right. Well, we think that I think the data is pretty clear here that the need for trusted adults in the lives of young people. And by the way, when we talk about young people, we're using that term very specifically because our research goes all the way down to 13-year-olds and all the way up to 25, because 13 is about the time for the rites of passage in many major religious traditions, when we would have had bar mitzvahs or confirmations or those kinds of things. And up to 25 is when the social science research says that that's about the age that it's taking now for young people on average to transition fully out of their home. Now, obviously, there are some that extend that further and there's some that leave earlier, but that seemed like a nice landing point. And so I think the first thing to recognize is just how much longer that stage of life is and how much more opportunity there is. And within that, the need for trusted adults is as important as ever. So perhaps the biggest thing to understand is when you say like, how are we doing this? Well, we approach this with a sociological rather than a theological or psychological perspective. And sociologically, what's happened over the last 50 to 75 years, but mostly in the last 50 years in this country, is this dramatic decline in institutional trust across all sectors of our society. And this is true for every generation, but particularly for younger. So when Gallup and Pew and our own research confirms this, when you ask people, how much do you trust the presidency? How much do you trust school districts? How much do you trust hospitals, et cetera? We've got good data on this going back for quite some time. And the trend is just this cratering, right? And when you only see this through the lens of your particular industry, so let's say you work in healthcare and you only look at the hospital data, you might think to yourself like, oh, we're doing a poor job as hospitals, or doctors aren't kind enough or something like this, or they make too many mistakes. But when you start looking at it sociologically and you realize like, oh my goodness, the loss of trust in institutions isn't confined to one institution, it's widespread across our entire society. Well, that that calls for a fundamentally different solution. The issue isn't to make doctors better, it's to change how we convey authority and how we gain expertise in the life of a person. So a big part of what we document here, when we shift that perspective, what we see is that young people especially, but really across the generations, we really have to be leading with relationships, but not in a way that sacrifices our expertise, right? And that is critical. We're not just saying like go be friends with people, right? Like that's not enough. We still want doctors to be doctors. We still want them to know how to solve, my hurt shoulder or my cancer or whatever. But if they don't come leading with relationships, fostering that sense of belonging, either interpersonally or as a part of a community, we won't listen to their expertise. Young people told us this time and time again in the research, and it backs up everything that we know sociologically in terms of where society is headed towards smaller, more contextual, more local.
Okay, so I'm just forming an image in my head that's, I keep coming back to it in a lot of different contexts. And it's this image of kind of like that Richard Scarry novel, the kid's book, where there's like each person in town that has their job. And there's like the local police officer, and there's the local baker, and there's the local doctor, And I feel like when I hear you describing what's going on at a sociological level, what I'm mapping in my head is this disconnect in society where if we lived in a small town, let's say, and we knew the one doctor in town was living across the street from us, and we knew them by name, and that was our doctor, and the police officer was over there, and in the health, whatever, right? The people that work these jobs are also our neighbors, and we know that we are sharing citizenship together. There's context that we would trust them more because we're humanized. But there's kind of this separating that's been happening in terms of the way that society's set up for all the reasons that they are, where the doctor I might see a different doctor every time I go to the doctor, and neither of us has any context or relationship to each other. It's entirely transactional. And the same with probably a whole bunch of other industries where we just kind of assume everybody's in it for themselves. I don't trust a doctor to give me sound advice. I trust them to act in their own interests and maybe prescribe me medications they're getting kickbacks for, and like all this other stuff, right? There's all this like issues around that. But maybe I would trust them a little bit more if I had some greater context. Is that kind of roughly what you're getting a handle on there?
It is, Tony, but I don't even think that you have to assume ill will on the part of the other person before trust erodes. So it's not that you have to think that you don't have to necessarily sit there and think that your doctor is lining their own pockets with prescription drug money. What we've got, you've got a smart audience, right? Can we get nerdy for like 1 second?
Please, absolutely.
Okay. So in the pre-industrial, so before factories world, right? Like we understood everybody around us because we were all basically living the same reality. Like we all more or less did the same things in these farming communities, small trade, groups and towns. But when the industrialized world comes along for the last couple of 100 years, now everybody's split out. So like, we've got a dentist who takes care of our teeth, and like I'm a professor at a university who teaches people, but I don't know what a dentist does, and certainly I don't know how like supply chains work to get groceries to my grocery store. I just assume that it's going to be there. I don't even know what my neighbors do, right? Like I don't, they live near me, but I don't know what they do for a living, except I know like 2 of them. So that world worked for a very long time, but when that trust, that's a world built entirely on the trust of expertise, right? So we trust and credentials. We trust that the dentist can do the thing that the dentist says that she can do because she has a credential on her wall that signifies that she's able to do it. It doesn't actually matter in that world how much my dentist knows me. Well, when the trust in those institutions starts to erode, like we've seen recently, now we're left in a tough spot because we've got all these institutions who don't understand that big trend, and they just keep leading with more credentials. So they keep telling you like, we've been in business for 150 years. I'm like, I don't care how long you've been in business, right? Like that doesn't convey the same thing in 2020 as it maybe did in 1970. Or we can hang all the diplomas we want on the wall, but like that doesn't matter as much. Like I don't think just because you have a diploma, it doesn't mean you're actually listening to me when I tell you how I hurt my shoulder and like why it hasn't fully healed and what I've tried in the past, because you're just going to do the same thing that you've always done. So the trick, though, is that we need some way of moving forward that doesn't get rid of that expertise, but couples it with this notion of like shared experience, or that we understand each other's reality, that we're doing some listening. At Springtide, we call that relational authority. That's the kind of authority that we need to have in somebody's life. And what the data tell us, we're writing about this in our State of Religion and Young People report. It's an annual study that's about to come out in October here. We just finished writing it up. But what that means is that when we drill down into like what that looks like in somebody's life, it's not that I want to go to a doctor because that doctor has also hurt his or her shoulder and doesn't know anything about medicine. Like, I don't want to just group around a whole bunch of people who have hurt shoulders. I do want them to be experts in how to repair that thing, but I don't think that their expertise matters unless they are listening to me and understand what it's like to have a hurt shoulder also. So we can't, like this sort of like authority through credentials is no longer enough. And there are not enough organizations that really understand that transition has already occurred and are, doing whatever they can to shift it. So we came out with this book, Meaning Making, in the summer, which is about the 8 values that young people have that draw them to organizations, whether it's for work or for volunteer or whatever. And what we find is that they all drive back to that same thing. And if you're an employer and you're wondering like, why can't I attract or retain talented young people to come and work for me? These values all come back to that notion of like, yes, expertise matters, but if we are not also living out values that young people care about and creating this overall sense of belonging with mission, then all of our expertise in terms of getting them here isn't going to make any difference. Any of the credentials that we might offer them, status, titles, money, there's a point at which they stop mattering, because the world around them has fundamentally changed. And it's critical that organizations and leaders understand that.
So, okay, so that critical understanding, I think that's where, because I'm a very kind of action-oriented person. Like, I love thinking at the higher level about what's going on, but then I also want to distill it down to, okay, so then what? What can we do? And I feel like that's where I tend to think from a grassroots perspective, because that's just where my experience is, how can I as an individual do this, or how can a person maybe rally their own little community group around it? But where do you see there being an action item for somebody who's tuning in to be able to say, well, we can actually shift this, and this is kind of like, is there an easy win here, in terms of mindset shift?
I think the mindset shift is just understanding that the thing that is impacting your organization is not just impacting your organization or industry. It's that loss of trust goes everywhere. So once we make that relatively easy shift, now we're talking about like, what can we do, right? And in belonging, we were able to let the data generate those things. So young people told us this really critical piece of information, which is that no matter, we were using attendance at after-school events or religious services, and it turned out that attending made no difference in terms of their loneliness or isolation scores or levels, but attendance with a relationship did make a difference. So just because they're showing up to work, or just because they're showing up to an after-school event, or just because they're showing up to your church, does not mean that they're connected like it maybe once did. Instead, there's this 3-step process that the data tell us. Step 1 is noticing them, step 2 is naming them, and step 3 is knowing them. And each of those, we can dive into those a little bit, but that's a relatively straightforward process. Noticing, naming, and knowing people. The way we track those and implement them, though, requires real leadership and sophistication and innovation, really.
Got it. Okay, so so let's say like I'm tuning in and I want to engage in this. Is there a process? Do you get into it in a resource that you have that we can kind of go and check out?
Yeah, so we've got that book. Their first study is called "Belonging: Reconnecting America's Loneliest Generation," and that's where we first lay out this noticed, named, known framework. And it sounds so simple that it almost escaped us as researchers to even document it. But that first step of noticing people. So what young people ended up telling us all the time was that most of the time in their lives, they feel invisible. They feel completely unseen. So what they told us is that first step of actually just acknowledging my presence in a space is critical. And that can be as simple as saying hello to somebody. Mark, so you mentioned CrossFit earlier, and up until COVID, I think this might have been, we were talking about this off air, but up until COVID, I belonged to a gym, and we haven't been going lately. But like that, my gym owner does such a good job of understanding that the most important calorie you're going to burn is the one that happens when you cross the threshold of the. I'm convinced that you like burn, most of your workout is just crossing the threshold of the door to the gym, right? Because once you're there, half the battle's over. So no matter what is going on in the gym, it doesn't make any difference. When somebody walks in, the gym owner greets them by name as they come through the front door. And that is like, if we could take that and extend that to the workplace and to our families and to young people in general, like if we think we've got a political season coming up here, for example, there's all kinds of political talk going on. And we've been surveying young people about sort of how they feel when they're around adults who are talking about politics, and they feel ignored and they feel dismissed by adults. But if we could acknowledge the fact that, like, just by showing up to be around that conversation and not burying your head in a device and going away to your room or to some other place to play a video game or go outside or something, that is a huge step for a person. And to notice that they're even involved in that is critical. A point of affirmation for adults, and is the first step towards community building. Absolutely essential. You can't do anything without noticing somebody first.
Yeah, so the noticing and then the naming and knowing that flow through from there. It makes so much sense to me because we see so many of the issues that are coming up around political discourse, around violence, school shootings, all those things. They share some roots in nobody's listening to me, nobody pays attention to me, nobody knows I exist.
Absolutely.
And every human needs to feel like their existence is acknowledged by others.
Yeah.
It's like a fundamental thing. And so some percentage of people end up going down very dark paths out of a desire for that acknowledgement. And, also a larger portion of people go down a less dark path that we may never see, that ends up leading to them suffering from issues around mental and emotional wellness related physical ailments that stem from emotional unwellness, right? And like racism and hatred and trolling online and toxicity and all these other things stem from nobody's paying attention to me, nobody cares about what I think, and then that leads to all this stuff. And so just giving people avenues to feel some sense of somebody here has seen that I exist, and even better, somebody has actually paid attention to me. Someone somebody asked me a question and I answered, and I felt like they were actually listening to what I had to say. It doesn't even matter if they agreed with me or not, or anything that happens after that. Simply feeling like, my God, somebody actually saw me and heard me tonight. And then also, so one of the ideas that came up in the conversations that I had with my friend Jillian Richardson, who I mentioned to you earlier, from the Joy List, around the events that she was doing at the Joy List Social and some of the other events that we've been studying, is unlike many events that happen where you basically go to consume the content, you go to sit in the audience, the person on stage talks to you, maybe you have a chance for some networking or chit chat before or after, if you happen to be extroverted enough to enjoy that, Otherwise, there's no, and even when you do that, how many times you're talking to somebody who's just waiting for their turn to speak. So there's no facilitated connection between people to see and be seen. So the theory that Jillian and I were working with some of the work we were doing, was create opportunities for people to connect to each other and have a real conversation, and to structure it such that you're going to say, okay, you're going to take turns. One of you's going to talk, the other one's going to listen. And then you're going to switch, right? And it could be a 2-minute per person exercise, but you can just see the energy of the room when you go from a circle of strangers that are all a little bit nervous to be there to now suddenly everybody's talking and connecting, and like life-changing connections happen like instantaneously. It's incredible to see, because not only do people feel heard, but then they also hear somebody else, and and in hearing someone explain their journey and their humanity, they become more real and more human, and then they realize, like I realize I'm not alone because I'm hearing somebody else is struggling too, or they have real human things that I can relate to, or that I can. So like even just creating opportunities for people to feel noticed, and then
Isn't that crazy though?
yeah.
Like, I mean, one of the things we know is that humans are fundamentally social creatures, right? If you provide for everybody, if you provide for somebody's physical needs, but neglect and ignore their social and emotional needs, that will not be enough to sustain them. And so it's counterintuitive that we now have to coach each other in terms of how to talk to one another, because it would seem like a natural thing. But you're absolutely right that, like, for whatever reason, and I talk to a lot of groups who want to give me their 2 cents about why they think we're in this situation, like it's social media, or it's lack of respect for parents, or families are dissenting, or whatever. And I just go back to them, I'm like, well, okay, like regardless of how you think we got here, the fact is, like, we're apparently in a place where we have to, like, teach you, like, we need people like Tony to come in and create opportunities and give you instructions on how to talk to each other, which is kind of crazy, but absolutely essential.
Exactly, and that's where I feel like there's an opportunity to maybe step out of the problem space and just focus on, hey, there's actually some real wins that can be delivered in a lot of different contexts. In a corporate context, in a religious context, in a social context, in a government context, where if you can create these opportunities for people to have some healthy connection and discourse between each other, it's a facilitation technique. It's 10 minutes that you add into a schedule of an existing program that could really flip the switch from it being something people consume to being something people really get something out of.
But it needs a certain amount of innovation as well. I mean, it is both simple in terms of its intent, but there is some sophistication and innovation that needs to happen here. The old adage that comes out of the corporate world, that what gets measured is what matters. It's not the other way around. Sort of indicates that we should be doing a better job of these things. How many companies and nonprofits have a CRM that they rely on, like wouldn't know what to do without their customer relationship manager, but they don't use those for their employees to track, like, have I actually spent any time with each individual employee this week or this month, right? If we're working in a lot of the settings that I talk to, we're working with kids in some sort of a campus situation or a ministry situation, they're tracking the numbers of kids who show up, but they're not tracking the number of times that they actually interacted with somebody. That's the kind of stuff that we need in order to make this relationship model scale, right? Because it can't just rely on one person's intent. We're going to need the same kind of sophistication that we've been bringing to other areas into this relationship and belonging space as well.
So that leads to kind of a larger question around this conversation I've been seeing people having around those kinds of metrics can be a little bit harder to pin down.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we do it? Like, what, do you have any sense of kind of like a way that we can get at it? Maybe that, the dream metric isn't right on its face, but there's a kind of like a secondary way of approaching it that can kind of get us closer. Like, I remember there was a story of a teacher who, I'm going to forget the exact details of it, but it was a teacher after a major school shooting who started having each student submit the list of students they want to sit next to, and then they used that to determine which students like didn't have any friends in the class, and that was, so basically they were able to identify patterns that identified problem students in ways that you wouldn't be able to notice on the surface necessarily. So I'm just curious if you came across anything like that, things that we could do that don't require like really elaborate data science or tech to get at it,
Yeah, so there's this. I mean, I can give you one concrete example. There's an article in Edutopia from 2017 called "The Power of Being Seen," and it's about a Nevada school that really just did exactly what I was saying, more or less, but adapted for their own context, where they really were just tracking, what kinds of interactions are we having with young people, our students in this case, and what is the quality of those interactions. So I think a slightly more sophisticated version might be like, well, let's whatever your context dictates, whatever your setting says matters. So if you're in a for-profit setting, maybe it's professional growth, right? If you're in a ministry setting, maybe it's spiritual development. And I think in terms of Excel spreadsheets a lot. So I would put those all in the column, like what are the stages of that? And then I've got every employee listed out, in the row, in each row, every volunteer listed out in each row, every young person listed out in the row. And then I'm just tracking at a very simple level. Where are they? And what do I need to do to move them to the next level? And when was the last point of contact? Like, this isn't rocket science, right? But and certainly there are way more sophisticated things that you could do and that other innovators would think of to bring to the space. But I think as a step one, that's a very low cost solution to getting started in terms of shifting the narrative over what we're tracking, as opposed to, say, these old when it was just about time spent or how many people showed up, and we could assume that belonging followed from that. Well, we can't assume those things anymore. The data are clear that if we're not fostering those steps intentionally and through relationships, we're not just going to get belonging. So now we have to start measuring different things.
Okay, this is actually okay. So I'm putting something together here that's making a lot of sense to me, which is we're basically saying we can't just track if people show up. We can't even just track if people talk to each other, or even if they have a good time. Like what are we really trying to get at when we talk about meaningful connection and relationships and
Right.
conquering a lack of belonging? And we're if it's just like, well, if we put people in a room and they talk to each other and they make a connection, they have a good time, and somehow we have a way of tracking that, great. But maybe what we really need to be doing is understanding the nature of the context of why the people are in the room and what that shared journey is. And then maybe we can look at the nature of that journey to help us understand it better, which leads me to this notion that I keep coming back to in my research of communities of practice, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea that the reason you're getting people into the room in the first place dictates a lot about what happens next. And so if that is poorly formed, then you're going to have a really uphill battle to get people to connect meaningfully, no
Or
matter.
if it's unintentionally formed. I mean, if you
But
just have
yes,
like,
right.
if you're just if you're together because the company says we're going to have a company picnic, and so that's why you're outside together, that's a like where again, I don't think that's a fundamentally bad idea. I think it used to be a good idea in a world where we trusted the institutions that we even worked for, and now we don't. So why on earth would I want to go to a picnic for this place, right?
Yeah,
We need intentionality between why we're gathering. So I think a really good example of this is I don't know if you're familiar with the dinner party. Have you heard of this?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
So dinner party, I mean, you may have talked about it on other shows. Like, dinner party's great because it's a group of strangers opening up their life to each other. But the reason they feel comfortable doing that is because there's a clear and distinct set of guidelines that govern those interactions that wouldn't necessarily make sense in any other place, right? But they make sense here because we're talking about loss, and particularly the loss of a family member around a meal. So there are some rules that are in place for this interaction that wouldn't be in place if we met each other on the street necessarily, but they're critical, right?
right. There's this inherent reason everybody's in the room
Yeah.
that is really important to everybody in the room, such that I wouldn't show up unless I resonated, and I'm showing up because it's important to me, and I recognize this is true of everyone else in the room as well. And so therefore, we have a really, really strong starting point for fostering meaningful connection between everybody in the room because we know that that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
And in less intentional spaces, it's not there. It's harder to conjure. And so
Right.
starting with
Well,
that,
so we
yeah,
we mask it with other things, right? So in a religious setting, we sort of make up for it by like trying to get people to agree. We say that here are the things that we believe in this space, as if that's actually true. We know from the research that not everybody at a synagogue believes in all the things that the synagogue believes in. And in the corporate setting, we have these like things stenciled on the walls that you know as you walk into work each day, that theoretically, but that's not true. And in fact, we know that that's never been true. The first sociological research that was ever done confirmed the notion that belonging precedes believing. It doesn't go the other way around. Like, we will not have a shared sense of belief or commonality until we feel like we belong somewhere. Every single time that we find a political party or an organization or a church getting it the other way around, and we try to say, okay, you have to believe to these things or believe in these things, this shared set of ideas, before we can say that you're one of us and part of the community, well, it doesn't work. It's tenuous at best. And a lot of times it's people just sort of like outright lying and saying it for a paycheck, but they're not actually on board.
Yeah, I feel like I've experienced this in my early community building days, where I got the sense that when people were in a room where they really felt like they loved the people who were in it, they loved the experience they were having, then they bought into the bigger thing, whether the bigger thing really mapped to what they would have bought into beforehand anyway. It was like, right. Well, I really like being in this room and I really like the people in this room, so I guess I believe in the thing that made this possible.
Yeah, we have some shared experience. I mean, I don't come from a military background, so I don't want to like necessarily claim this as truth, but I think there's some wisdom in the adage that like soldiers go to battle for each other, not because of some larger cause. Like, when it comes down to it, like, they're in it and going to do what's necessary for the people right around them in their unit and in their group. And certainly everyday life is not like war, but there is some truth to that. Like, those relationships are what carry us through the hard times and keep us focused on some bigger goal, as opposed to just this sort of these sometimes amorphous ideals.
That makes a lot of sense. So I want to shift gears just a little bit, because you have a insight into an area that I really am curious about, which is younger folks. And what I'm finding is that when we deal with issues around loneliness, around belonging, around societal issues that I want to shift, I kind of draw a very obvious conclusion that so much of the most progress can be made with the folks who are younger, where they're less set in their ways, and there's more progress to be made, in terms of a win, that perpetuates outward. But reaching younger folks and finding the right ways to connect and solve the needs for them is less obvious to somebody who doesn't deal with that world.
Yeah.
And so, like, I don't have experience dealing with youth. All my work has been mostly dealing with adults. And so I'm curious, I guess, where are there opportunities to really connect with folks in the younger generations and maybe create some dialogue? And religious institutions are a good example of, in theory, where that should be, because they're cross-generation. You can have 4 generations of people showing up at the same time every week. Maybe not facilitating a connection between them in the way that they could be, but there need to be some cross-generational opportunities there. So yeah, I'm just curious, like, what are your thoughts in terms of reaching younger folks and where there's progress that can be made there?
Yeah, I think it's exactly the right question, and that's in large part why we wrote Meaning Making, because we realized that there was a set of values, not necessarily to displace old values about accomplishment or goals, achievement, that kind of stuff, financial security, et cetera, but that there are new values emerging that were dictating a lot of the decisions that younger people were making. And so, the premise, the knife cuts both ways here, that if you embody these 8 values as an organization, it will attract young people, and if you don't have them, it will largely drive them away. They'll be looking for other places. And so you're right to point to religious places, religious institutions as a place where this can happen, but increasingly where we see this actually happening, especially in the intergenerational space, is at work. This COVID moment, hopefully it's just a moment, when we all look back on this 20 years post, that is happening right now, is going to exacerbate this even more. So we've got people who are delaying retirement, and yet they're still graduating young people. And so we're going to have more intergenerational opportunities in the workspace than we would have necessarily thought we would have had even just a year ago. So the idea of like, how do we bridge this gap and engage with young people, and is, I think, largely answered through a conversation about values. And so whether it's that, you know, we really want to focus on being inclusive or impactful, that we just need to stop with this notion that somehow work can or even should stop at 5 o'clock when young people go home. That's just not, it isn't it obscures the diversity of these younger generations, which is the most diverse generation we've ever had. The realities of their economic situations, which are often precarious. So they're not looking for work to only return a paycheck. They're demanding and expecting that it returns more. And in terms of like bleeding into the things that they care about in their regular life. So on the religious side, you know, I think there's some real battles to be fought there, in ways that religious organizations are not always well set up to do. They've largely abdicated their role in many of these spaces, but organizations who understand the way that talent acquisition impacts their bottom line will, if they have not seen this, they will shortly, you know, about how important it is to foster a sense of belonging around values for young people, because that's going to be the key to attracting talent, retaining it, and developing it.
So if, for example, I'm maybe a clergy member, I'm a leader of a religious organization, and I want to address this issue, and maybe I'm not somebody who's already like really pushing the edge of the curve, but I'm not totally like a curmudgeon stuck in my ways, but I'm just trying to get a handle on this. I'm imagining that one way I could do that is to apply kind of the framework that we talked about earlier, to start with noticing and then go to naming and knowing, and engaging the members of the congregation or even of the community in ways that maybe are a little bit more accessible and a little bit more, I want to listen to you more than I want to tell you kind of a mindset, right? And then kind of create some way for folks to build trust and to build a sense of, hey, they see me, they actually are interested in what I have to say, they recognize that I'm here, and they don't want to just, you know, browbeat me with dogma and shame me for not following all the rules.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, obviously, starting with the people that already know you best is going to give you the practice and the skills that you need in order to enact and build the kinds of systems that it's going to take to scale something like that. But the research also does give some indication that if you really want to stem the tide of loneliness and isolation among young people, especially, you could do well to focus on those who are at the margins. Because what happens is that when we think about what belonging really is, it's a set of networks, and networks by nature are linked to several other people, ideally, and not just one. So if we go to those young people who have 0 or 1 connection in their life, and we start building them up at the edges, then what that does is create a kind of firewall that builds connections further and deeper along the margins, but also resonates and ripples back into the group. So starting from the inside and working out isn't always as effective. I mean, it needs to be done, but it can't be the only thing. We should also be looking for those really hard cases and spending the time and resources, because the payoff there over the long haul is significant.
Amazing. And so, so if you can identify kind of folks who fit that that profile, and you can start with just, you know, some case studies, right? Just individual people you can name. You know, one of the things I've learned in teaching other people community building techniques is how much we've grown to rely upon broadcast media to engage our communities, and I feel like I can't say often enough, just talk to the people themselves.
Pick up the phone.
Yeah, pick up the phone, and like we have such a resistance to it. But if you like in the co-working world, which I come from, you know, I say make a list of your members and rank it by their level of engagement in your community, and then, you know, block it out by, you know, the super members, which you could take them out to lunch and talk about how to maximize their role in the community. And then the middle folks, which you can engage in their own way, and then the folks who you don't even know who they are, what their deal is, you know. And there's very specific ways to engage with each, but basically, you know, I deal so many times with somebody who's running a community program, and they're trying to get their members to show up, and they can get a few of the people at the top to come, right, but nobody else is coming, and they don't know why. And I say, well, have you asked them? Like, have you asked them why they're not coming, or have you invited them? And one of the great quotes, what's his name, from The Art of Community, is
Charles Vogel.
Yes, Charles Vogel. He says, he said, have you invited anybody? And they said, well, we sent it to our mailing list. And he said, no, have you invited anybody? Like, have you asked?
That's that relational authority. Like, people need to be invited and seen and heard, but it also matters that they're invited by the person who's in charge.
Yeah.
That expertise coupled with a shared sense of, like, I understand what your world is like, is crucial.
Yeah, I feel like you could send a newsletter to 100 people and get 10 people to show up, or you could send a text message to 10 people and get 10 people to show up, and those people are going to be like really excited to come,
Right.
And so that sounds like where there's a lot of opportunity, maybe for anybody tuning in, to say in whatever context you're in, if you're in a position where maybe you're managing a community or you're working in a context where there's a large group of people, you want to try to up the belonging level and understand how to foster a healthier culture, go out to lunch with the super members, but then also identify the people on the margins and give them a little extra TLC and extra listening, for their sake and for yours, to educate you. Because somebody down there in that context, or somebody down there on the margins of connectedness, is probably going to be able to give you a tremendous insight into your own world that you just can't see from your own perspective. And you might end up being surprised what you find. I know when I was running my co-working space, this is a quick story, there was this pod of people that were working in my space that they would always come in and they would always just be on their headphones and just typing away. And for me as a community manager, I don't like that. I want everybody kind of like hanging out and being social and talking to each other. And I was always like, what is their deal? Because they're coming in every day, like they seem to be happy, but like I don't get what's going on. And it wasn't until I think it was one of the members of my team, she got to know one of the people in that pod, and she found out. She reported to me. She says, "Oh, they're actually on a private chat channel with each other, and they're socializing like crazy all day, and they're like having the best time, and they love it here." And you would just never even, like, I had no clue. It was months.
Right.
And I thought these people weren't happy, and they're doing great. So, that's a happy ending to a difficult situation. But, like, I had no clue, me being the top of a very tiny little, world, what was going on amongst the people among me until I got some view into it. So that seems like a really valuable kind of insight and something actionable that we can play with.
I think that's 100% right, Tony, that it's, it's noticing, taking that first step of noticing somebody. But we, if we're going to do our jobs well in any of these spaces, we have to be thinking about how to do that at scale. And, these methods of tracking, like, well, who's not opening the newsletter? How many people are showing up here, but not ever, access, like using the break room or the kitchen or whatever in your co-working space, like whatever that is, we have to be tracking those things so we can start making like really targeted efforts that create, and the way we get to scale is through culture. That create the culture that we're looking for. Because if it just relies on you, Tony, to foster relationships with all 75 people at your co-working space, like that's impossible. We've got to get.
I tried it. Yeah, it does work.
By focusing on those highly engaged people and on the people at the margins, what happens over time is that we tip into this place where our culture becomes one of belonging. And then they start welcoming each other and noticing each other, and we teach them how to do that, et cetera. But the underlying notion here that like it starts by noticing them is critical. I mean, most co-working spaces wouldn't even have somebody paying attention to whether or not somebody was on their headphones all day.
Despite my best efforts. But I'll tell you another really quick story with November Project. Are you familiar with November Project?
No, it's new to me.
They're these fitness groups, totally free, all over the world. They meet at 6:28 in the morning once a week. And they do like high intensity interval training in like parks all times of year, but they're intensely community oriented. And a big part of what makes them so great is that they love bomb the heck out of newcomers. So the moment you show up, they're like, anybody new here? Oh, you're new? Get in the middle of the circle. All right, everybody jump up and down. Let's get to know you. Let's ask you some questions. And I didn't realize, but in the first, after that, all of the participants are instructed to ask questions of newcomers while they are running and doing their workouts. And then at the end, they do a close the loop of like, what did we learn about our newcomers today? And there's just this incredible sense of like, wow, I showed up as a stranger and instantly I feel like I'm a special part of this community. And it's just the onboarding process, some of the pieces of that.
Very
John,
cool.
I feel like we could talk for hours more. I hope we do get to talk for hours more at some point. But I want to be respectful of your time. Before we go, can you tell me a little bit about, is there anything that's like next for you that you want to plug? And then what are the links? Where do people find you and your stuff?
Absolutely. So people can obviously find Belonging, Reconnecting America's Loneliest Generation, and Meaning Making, the 8 Values That Drive America's Newest Generations on Amazon. Coming up, you can find at springtideresearch.org. We've gotten a very generous gift that's going to allow us to make, for people in your audience who care about religion, we're going to release the first annual State of Religion in Young People, and the gift is allowing us to do that in digital form for free and covering the cost of printing. The cost of the physical copy will just be for printing and shipping. So that's going to come out in October, and that's going to lay out really where young people are at with thinking about big religious, quote, in air quotes, like big tent religion, values and ideals and practices in their lives, and how we can foster more meaning with them.
Amazing. I can't wait to read that. So grateful for the work that you're doing. So that's springtideresearch.org.
That's
and
right.
I'll just personally plug your Dr. Josh Packard on Twitter.
Yeah.
DrJoshPackard, and then We Are Springtide on Twitter as well.
Yeah,
Josh,
you can see all of our research findings there.
Great, thank you.
A lot of it.
Yeah, that's actually, I think, how I found you was through probably some of our mutual contacts reposted, and I was just amazed by all the stuff you all were sharing. So great stuff. Josh, thank you.
I appreciate this.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. It's been a great conversation. I'm jazzed. I'm ready to go help some people now. So let's keep it going, and we'll keep in touch.
Wonderful.
All right, thanks, Josh.